Part 1 was the European story. 3 centuries of European eyes, looking at the center of Australia from the outside. To them, the interior seemed hostile, empty, impossible to read. But that was only one way of looking. There was another viewpoint, on the same ground, at the same time, for 50,000 years. It saw a different country entirely, one that was named, mapped, tended, sung, in a language Europeans had decided not to read. In 1788, the British arrived and recorded that they had found a wilderness. They were standing in the middle of an estate. That's not a turn of phrase. It's the central argument of the historian Bill Gamm-Idge, in a book whose title says it outright: The Biggest Estate on Earth. And the way he proves it is what makes it so hard to dismiss. Gamm-Idge went back to the earliest European evidence. The first settlers and explorers owned paintings, sketches, and diaries. And he noticed something strange in them. Again and again, the newcomers described the country as looking like an English gentleman's park. Open grassy meadows with trees spaced out as if deliberately, clear lines of sight, the whole thing weirdly tended. They meant it as praise. How lovely, how naturally park-like. They didn't grasp what they were actually saying. Because parks don't happen by accident. That open, dappled, grassy landscape was not nature. It was agriculture, just not an agriculture Europeans could recognize, because there were no fences and no fields. The tool wasn't the plow, it was fire. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal people across the continent had practiced what's now often called cultural burning, deliberate, patient, fine-grained use of low fires to shape the land. Burning in the right season cleared undergrowth, encouraged fresh grass, drew grazing animals to predictable places, opened pathways, and protected the country from the catastrophic wildfires that fuel buildup makes inevitable. It was landscape management on a continental scale, encoded in knowledge and law and passed down across hundreds of generations. The natural beauty the First Fleet admired was the visible result of an unimaginably long, sophisticated project of care. And here's the devastating second half of Gamm-Idge's argument. When that management stopped, when Aboriginal people were killed, removed, or forbidden from tending their country, the land changed. The open grasslands thickened into scrub. The fuel built up. The very wildness Europeans believed they had discovered was, in many places, something they created by halting the practice that had kept it open. Wilderness, in other words, wasn't the land's natural state. It was what the land became once the people who knew it were no longer allowed to manage it. Now hold that next to a single object, an Aboriginal dot painting from the Western Desert tradition. To an untrained European eye, it reads as abstract art, fields of dots, concentric circles, connecting lines, in ochre and red and white. But many of these works aren't abstract at all. They're maps, read from above, the way you'd read country from the sky. A set of concentric circles can mark a waterhole or a significant site. The lines running between them can trace the routes between those places, the paths an ancestor traveled, which are also, simultaneously, the practical directions for how to move through that country and survive it. Information that is geographic, historical, legal, and sacred, all carried in the same image, because in that worldview, those things were never separate. So set the two documents side by side, the European map of the interior, a blank, often stamped unknown, and the Aboriginal painting of the same country, dense, saturated, every element naming a place, a story, an obligation. The anthropologist D.B. or A. Bird Rose, who spent years working with Aboriginal communities, recorded how, for many groups, and I want to be careful here, because these are hundreds of distinct nations with distinct traditions, not one interchangeable culture. The land is not property at all. It's a living presence with a name, something you belong to, that you're responsible to, that you care for the way you care for kin. They call it country. and country is precisely, exhaustively known. It was never nameless. It had been named by countless names, songs, and stories for tens of thousands of years. The blank on the European map was never a fact about the land. It was a fact about the map makers. They simply could not see at that resolution, which brings us to why the naming mattered so much. And this is the part that turns a perception problem into a political one. The cultural historian Paul Carter argued that colonization doesn't just happen through ships and guns. It happens through naming. When an explorer attaches a European name to a bay, a river, a mountain, he isn't merely labeling it. He's overwriting it, replacing a place that already had meaning with one that now exists inside his language, his maps, his crown's claim. To name a thing in the colonial grammar is to declare, "This is mine because I can say it." This wasn't unique to Australia. It's the standard operating system of empire. In North America, a continent of existing indigenous place names was papered over with the names of European towns, saints, and investors. New York, New England, 1,000 transplanted homelands. In India, the British didn't only rename places, they surveyed and mapped the entire subcontinent in a decades-long imperial project, fixing it inside British knowledge and therefore British control. Mapping was never neutral. To map a place was to own it. But the Australian interior did something the others couldn't or wouldn't do so completely. It refused the names. The land was so resistant to European categories that the naming project kept stalling at the edge of the desert. And when a writer like White stands at that edge and finds the language failing, the sentences breaking down, the words running out, that isn't only an aesthetic experience. In Carter's terms, it's the colonial project hitting its own limit. Its sovereignty, quite literally, failing to take. They held a European dictionary of landscape and faced a continent that had already been written, completely, precisely, for 50,000 years, in a language they had decided not to read. In 1968, the anthropologist W.E.H. Stan Nair gave a series of public lectures and named the thing directly. He called it the Great Australian Silence. His point was that white Australia had built its entire national story with a piece deliberately left out. For the better part of 2 centuries, Aboriginal people were all but absent from the country's account of itself. Not through simple ignorance, Stan Nair argued, but through something more structured, a turning away, a silence with a shape to it. And once you see that, the literary emptiness we've been tracing stops looking like an aesthetic mood and starts looking like the same silence in another key. Writing the land as empty did work. If the center was a void, then no one had been displaced from it. If it had always been blank, no one had to account for how it was emptied. The aesthetic of vast, unpeopled space and the historical erasure of the people who lived there were not 2 phenomena. They were one act, performed in 2 registers, one in literature, one in law. The law took longest to break. For 2 centuries, Australia rested on a legal fiction that the continent had effectively belonged to no one when the British arrived. That changed in 1992, when the High Court, in the case brought by a Torres Strait Islander man named Eddie Mah Bowe, finally rejected that fiction and recognized that Indigenous people held rights to their land that predated the Crown. It was, in a sense, the law admitting what the dot paintings had said all along. The place was never empty. And there was a second reckoning, harder to put into words. For much of the 20th century, Aboriginal children were removed from their families by the state. The generations now remembered as the stolen generations. In 1997, a national inquiry documented it, and what it described, at its heart, was a severing. Children taken not only from parents, but from country, from the specific land that, in their traditions, knew them and held them. To grasp the full weight of that, you have to hold everything this essay has built. That for these cultures, to be taken from your country isn't only to lose a home. It's to be cut off from the living thing that tells you who you are. So return, finally, to where we started, to the strangest fact in this whole story. White settler literature and Aboriginal tradition, two worldviews that barely spoke to each other for 2 centuries, arrive at the very bottom at the same conclusion. Both understand that this land is older than people. Both understand that no human being can truly own it. On the central fact, they agree completely. They just learned opposite lessons from it. The Aboriginal traditions concluded, therefore we belong to the land, and our task is to care for it. The white writers concluded, therefore we should fear it. Same truth, 2 responses. And the difference between them was never about courage, or sensitivity, or talent. It was about one question, the only one that ever mattered here. Who believed they owned the place? The people who thought they could own it wrote 200 years of dread. The people who knew they belonged to it had been singing it, by name, for 50,000. The land was never empty. Emptiness was a failure of sight, never a property of the land.